The story begins in a moment compressed by history, where the weight of an entire war seems to press inward rather than outward. The setting is confined, deliberately unremarkable, stripped of grandeur or menace, yet charged with invisible tension. It is a room shaped not by architecture but by expectation. Walls stand close, the ceiling low enough to feel intrusive, as though designed to remind anyone inside that freedom is temporary and conditional. The air is cold, not simply in temperature but in sensation, as if warmth itself has been rationed by years of conflict. Every sound, boots on stone, fabric shifting, the faint scrape of a chair, feels amplified, not because it is loud, but because silence has learned how to listen. The man at the center of this moment enters already braced for impact. His body moves before his thoughts, shoulders drawn inward, spine stiff, chin lowered just enough to signal submission without surrender. He has rehearsed this posture many times in his mind, shaped by stories, warnings, and memories that insist authority must always announce itself through cruelty. Fear has trained him well. It has taught him where to stand, how to breathe, when to remain still. It has taught him that humiliation is not an aberration of war but one of its most reliable tools. His cold is not merely physical. It is the cold that arrives when certainty collapses into dread. His hands feel distant from his body, fingers numb, as though they belong to someone else. His breath is shallow, carefully controlled, each inhale measured so it cannot betray him. He expects insults to arrive swiftly, perhaps theatrically, spoken with the confidence of men who believe domination is proven through volume and disdain. He anticipates being reduced to a symbol rather than treated as a person, flattened into a category shaped by uniforms, languages, and flags. The camera, if there were one, would not rush to his face. It would linger on small details instead: the faint tremor in his jaw, the way his boots hesitate for a fraction of a second before crossing the threshold, the reflexive tightening of his fists before he forces his hands to relax. These are not gestures of weakness but of conditioning. They reveal a man who has learned that survival often depends on anticipating pain before it is delivered. He has learned that expectation can be a form of armor, even when it is forged from fear. The room itself seems to wait. It does not announce hostility, nor does it offer reassurance. Its neutrality is unsettling, because neutrality in wartime feels like deception. He scans the space quickly, eyes trained to identify threats, exits, angles of vulnerability. He notes the placement of furniture, the distance between bodies, the absence of overt weaponry. This absence does not comfort him. On the contrary, it deepens his unease. Violence, when visible, at least obeys familiar rules. Restraint introduces uncertainty. The men already inside the room do not move to confront him. There is no barked command, no sharp gesture demanding compliance. Their posture is composed, almost formal, shaped by routines that predate this war and will likely outlast it. They acknowledge his presence without spectacle, as though he is expected, as though his arrival requires no performance of dominance. This lack of reaction unsettles him more than open aggression would have. It denies him the script he has prepared to follow. He becomes acutely aware of his own breathing, of the way his chest rises and falls against his will. In his mind, memories surface unbidden. Other rooms, other faces, other moments where power announced itself through cruelty. He remembers the sharp edge of words designed to wound before any physical blow was struck. He remembers laughter used as a weapon, humiliation delivered as casually as a command. These memories tighten around him now, shaping his anticipation of what must come next. Time stretches. Seconds feel elongated, as though the war itself has slowed to observe this encounter. The silence grows dense, not empty. It presses against his ears, forcing him to confront his own expectations. He realizes that he has already judged what these men will do, not based on their actions, but based on what the war has taught him to assume. His fear has filled the room before anyone else has had the chance to speak. The narrative subtly pulls back to reveal that this moment is not isolated. It is the product of years of conflict that have trained entire populations to equate authority with abuse. Empires have risen and enforced obedience through terror, leaving behind generations conditioned to expect cruelty as the default language of power. This man carries that inheritance into the room with him. His fear is personal, but it is also historical. The stillness continues, and with it comes a strange dissonance. He feels exposed, not because he is being attacked, but because he is not. Courtesy, unspoken, restrained, hangs in the air like an unanswered question. It forces him into an unfamiliar position. He cannot perform submission convincingly without provocation, yet he cannot assert dignity without risking punishment. The absence of insult leaves him suspended between roles, unsure which version of himself is required. His senses sharpen, searching for meaning in the smallest movements. A glance exchanged between officers, the subtle adjustment of a sleeve, the measured pacing of footsteps. Everything is deliberate, yet nothing is overtly threatening. This discipline carries its own authority, one that does not rely on fear to function. He senses, dimly, that whatever power exists in this room does not need to announce itself loudly. It simply exists, confident in its own legitimacy. The cold persists, but it begins to shift. It is no longer purely the chill of fear. It becomes something more complex, a recognition that his assumptions may be inadequate, that the moral landscape he has navigated throughout the war may not be as uniform as he believed. This realization does not comfort him. It destabilizes him. Certainty, even when grim, can be easier to endure than ambiguity. As the chapter draws toward its close, the moment remains unresolved. No insult arrives. No voice rises to confirm his fears. Instead, the silence holds, heavy and intentional. He stands within it, forced to confront not only the men before him, but the expectations he brought with him into the room. The war, in this instant, is not being fought with weapons or words, but with restraint. The final image of this opening chapter is not one of action, but of suspension. A man poised between dread and disbelief, braced for cruelty that does not come, standing in a space where power expresses itself through quiet control. The room remains silent, and in that silence, the first crack appears in the moral certainty he has relied upon to survive. The silence that follows does not resolve itself quickly. Instead, it deepens, settling into the room with a patience that feels intentional. It is not the awkward pause of uncertainty, nor the charged stillness before an outburst, but something more controlled, almost practiced. The man senses that this quiet has been cultivated, refined over time, used as deliberately as any raised voice or clenched fist. It is a silence that does not seek to intimidate through chaos, but through order. He waits for the inevitable shift, the moment when courtesy will peel back to reveal contempt. His body remains rigid, muscles held in a state of readiness that borders on exhaustion. Every instinct urges him to prepare for verbal assault, for the sharp precision of insults meant to strip him of dignity before any formal judgment is passed. Yet nothing comes. No accusation, no mocking tone, no deliberate mispronunciation of his name to remind him of his foreignness. The absence of these familiar markers of power leaves him unmoored. The men in the room behave as though time is not an adversary. Their movements are unhurried, economical, free of the nervous energy that often accompanies interrogation. Papers are arranged carefully. Chairs are adjusted with quiet efficiency. Even their glances are measured, neither avoiding him nor lingering too long. This balance unsettles him more than hostility ever could. It suggests a confidence that does not require constant reinforcement. As the seconds stretch into minutes, he becomes acutely aware of how deeply his expectations have shaped his fear. He realizes that he has spent years learning how to endure cruelty, how to shrink himself in the presence of power. He knows how to absorb insults without reacting, how to make his face unreadable, how to survive by becoming smaller. But he does not know how to respond to restraint. There is no practiced posture for this situation, no mental script to follow. The courtesy in the room is not warm. It offers no comfort, no reassurance. It is formal, almost impersonal, grounded in procedures that value control over emotion. Yet it is precisely this lack of malice that unsettles him. Courtesy denies him the clarity of enemy behavior. It forces him to confront the possibility that power does not always need cruelty to function, that dominance can be exercised quietly, without spectacle. He begins to suspect that this silence itself is a test, not of loyalty or guilt, but of composure. He wonders if they are watching for cracks, for signs of weakness that will emerge when he realizes he cannot provoke or predict them. The room becomes a mirror, reflecting his own internal turbulence back at him. His fear has nowhere to attach itself, no obvious threat to fixate on, and so it turns inward. His thoughts drift, unbidden, to the systems he has known, where authority was loud and unforgiving, where obedience was enforced through humiliation and respect was extracted through fear. In those systems, silence was rare and dangerous, usually preceding violence. Here, silence feels different. It feels institutional, deliberate, almost ceremonial. It carries the weight of tradition rather than impulse. This realization introduces a new kind of anxiety. If cruelty is not guaranteed, then neither is victimhood. He cannot rely on suffering to define his role. He must confront himself as something other than a target. This possibility is destabilizing. It challenges the narrative he has used to endure the war, the belief that all power is inherently brutal, and that survival depends on anticipating that brutality. The British courtesy he encounters is not framed as kindness. It is closer to indifference, but an indifference shaped by rules and expectations rather than disregard. It suggests a belief in process, in hierarchy maintained through consistency rather than fear. He senses that he is being treated not as an object of contempt, but as a subject within a system that demands restraint from both sides. As time passes, the silence begins to press on him in unexpected ways. Without insults to deflect or endure, his mind has space to wander. Doubts surface. He wonders whether the cruelty he has endured elsewhere was not an inevitability of war, but a choice made by those who wielded power without restraint. This thought unsettles him deeply. It threatens to unravel the moral framework that allowed him to accept suffering as unavoidable. The room remains composed, its atmosphere unchanged. This consistency reinforces the impression that what he is experiencing is not exceptional, but routine. Courtesy here is not a gesture extended to him personally, it is a standard upheld regardless of who stands before them. This realization strips away any illusion of moral superiority he might claim through victimhood. He is not being spared cruelty out of mercy, but because cruelty is not considered necessary. He feels exposed in a new way. Without the familiar armor of anticipated abuse, he must confront his own identity stripped of oppositional clarity. He is neither defiant nor submissive, neither condemned nor absolved. He exists in a liminal space where behavior, not suffering, will define him. This realization introduces a quiet panic. Pain, at least, offers certainty. Ambiguity demands responsibility. The silence persists, and with it grows an uncomfortable respect. Not admiration, but recognition. He recognizes the discipline required to maintain restraint in a war defined by excess. He recognizes that courtesy, in this context, is not softness but control. It is a demonstration of power that does not need to announce itself loudly to be felt. As this chapter draws to a close, the man remains standing, suspended within this unexpected stillness. His fear has not vanished, but it has transformed. It is no longer the fear of imminent humiliation, but the fear of moral disorientation. The room has not attacked him, but it has challenged him in a way he did not anticipate. The silence remains unbroken, heavy with implication. In denying him the cruelty he expected, it has forced him to confront a more unsettling truth, that the war he believed to be governed by brutality alone may also be shaped by restraint, and that this restraint carries its own quiet, unsettling power. As the stillness continues, the man's attention turns inward with an intensity that surprises him. With no external hostility to react against, his thoughts begin to surface unfiltered, rising one after another like debris in calm water. Fear no longer has a single direction. It cannot rush forward toward an obvious threat, so it circles within him, reshaping itself into suspicion. He begins to search for meaning behind every controlled gesture, every measured pause, convinced that this restraint must conceal something sharper, something delayed rather than denied. He studies the faces in the room more closely now. They are composed, almost deliberately neutral, as though trained to prevent emotion from leaving any trace. There is no satisfaction in their expressions, no hunger for domination. This absence unsettles him. He has learned to read cruelty easily. It announces itself through impatience, through excess, through a desire to be seen. What confronts him now is harder to interpret. It feels colder not because it is cruel, but because it is opaque. The idea takes root that this courtesy may itself be a form of control. He wonders whether the silence is meant to disarm him, to draw him into speaking first, to make him fill the void with his own uncertainty. In other places, interrogations were theatrical, designed to overwhelm the senses. Here, the lack of pressure becomes pressure. The room offers him nothing to resist against, and so resistance loses its shape. His breathing slows, not out of calm, but out of necessity. He realizes that any visible anxiety would feel like a confession in this environment. The discipline around him demands discipline in return. He adjusts his posture, straightening slightly, aware that how he carries himself now matters more than what he might say. This realization is unsettling. He is accustomed to systems where dignity is stripped regardless of behavior. Here, dignity seems conditional, something that can be maintained or lost through one's own conduct. The silence sharpens his awareness of time. Each passing moment feels accounted for, as though recorded somewhere unseen. He senses that impatience would be interpreted as weakness, that agitation would be noted rather than provoked. This quiet scrutiny feels heavier than shouted accusations. It suggests a system confident enough to wait. His mind drifts back to other encounters during the war, moments where power was loud and unmistakable. He remembers how fear was manufactured deliberately, how unpredictability was used as a weapon. In those places, authority relied on spectacle to sustain itself. Here, authority seems embedded in routine. It does not need to intimidate overtly because it trusts its own permanence. This contrast unsettles him deeply. It forces him to confront the possibility that the cruelty he has witnessed elsewhere was not a universal language of power, but a particular choice. This thought feels dangerous, even treasonous to his own survival instincts. If cruelty was chosen, then restraint could have been chosen too. That realization introduces a moral complexity he has long avoided. He feels a flicker of resentment. Courtesy, in this context, feels almost accusatory. It exposes the excesses of systems that relied on fear by demonstrating that order can be maintained without it. He wonders whether this is intentional, whether the British presence here is meant to embody a contrast rather than simply enforce control. The idea that manners could function as a form of moral positioning unsettles him more than open hostility would have. As he waits, he becomes increasingly aware of his own internal noise. Doubts surface that he has suppressed throughout the war. He wonders whether his own actions, his own compromises, were shaped not only by necessity but by the normalization of brutality around him. Without insults to deflect blame onto his captors, he is left alone with his conscience. The room's restraint begins to feel like a mirror, reflecting back the chaos he carries within himself. He recognizes that his fear has been trained by environments where power demanded submission through degradation. Here, submission is implied rather than enforced. Compliance is expected, not extracted. This expectation feels heavier because it assumes his participation. He suspects now that this encounter is not about punishment but about assessment. Not of guilt alone, but of character. This realization tightens something in his chest. He has learned how to endure pain, but he has not learned how to be evaluated quietly. Silence leaves space for judgment that cannot be argued against. The courtesy remains impersonal, unwavering. It does not soften, but it does not harden either. This consistency reinforces the sense that he is not dealing with individual temperament, but with an institutional ethos. The men before him are not improvising their authority, they are embodying it. This makes resistance feel futile in a different way. There is no individual weakness to exploit, no emotional reaction to provoke. He feels smaller now, not because he is being diminished, but because the scale of what confronts him has shifted. He is no longer facing anger, he is facing structure. This realization brings with it a quiet despair. Structures do not shout. They do not explain themselves. They simply persist. Yet within this despair, another emotion flickers, unexpected and unwelcome. It resembles respect, though he resists naming it as such. He recognizes the discipline required to maintain this level of restraint in wartime, to uphold codes of conduct when violence would be easier. This recognition does not absolve his captors, but it complicates his understanding of them. As this chapter draws toward its end, the man's suspicion remains unresolved. He does not trust the silence, but he can no longer dismiss it as a prelude to cruelty. It stands on its own, an expression of power that unsettles him precisely because it does not conform to the patterns he knows. He remains still, suspended between fear and recalibration. The room has not revealed its purpose, but it has altered his internal landscape. In denying him the familiar contours of brutality, it has forced him to confront a more disquieting uncertainty, that the war he thought he understood may also be a contest of values, fought quietly in rooms like this, where restraint itself becomes a form of dominance. The realization does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds slowly, almost reluctantly, as the man continues to stand within the disciplined stillness of the room. What first appeared to be an absence now begins to reveal its shape. The courtesy surrounding him is no longer merely confusing. It starts to feel deliberate in a way that is difficult to dismiss. He senses that the balance of power has never been in question here. It has simply been expressed differently than he expected. He begins to understand that restraint itself can be an assertion. The men before him do not need to raise their voices, because nothing in this space depends on emotional dominance. Authority here does not seek validation through fear. It operates on the assumption that it will be obeyed, not because it is terrifying, but because it is established. This confidence unsettles him more deeply than threats ever could. It leaves no room for defiance that can be framed as courage, no cruelty against which he can define himself as wronged. As this awareness grows, something shifts in the way he perceives the room. What once felt neutral now feels weighted with intention. Every measured movement, every controlled pause, seems to reinforce the same message. Power does not need to perform itself to exist. He realizes that the silence he has been enduring is not meant to punish him, but to position him. It places him within a hierarchy that does not require his humiliation to function. This recognition fractures his long-held assumptions. Throughout the war, power had always arrived loudly, accompanied by spectacle and excess. He had learned to associate authority with emotional volatility, with the need to dominate visibly and repeatedly. Here, that association collapses. The absence of insult becomes a statement in itself, one that quietly exposes the fragility of systems that relied on cruelty to sustain obedience. He feels an unexpected sense of displacement. Without cruelty to react against, his moral footing feels uncertain. Suffering had always offered him a kind of clarity. It allowed him to believe that the world was divided cleanly between oppressors and the oppressed, between those who inflicted pain and those who endured it. This room refuses that simplicity. It does not absolve him, but it does not degrade him either. It demands that he exist somewhere between those categories. The men around him remain composed, their demeanor unchanged. They do not appear to be making a point, yet the point is unmistakable. Their restraint implies a belief that dignity is not a privilege granted selectively, but a baseline expectation maintained even under strain. This implication unsettles him because it reframes the war not just as a contest of nations, but as a confrontation between moral frameworks. He begins to recognize the irony embedded in the situation. The very courtesy that denies him the role of victim also denies his captors the satisfaction of cruelty. It reveals a confidence that does not depend on diminishing others. This realization forces him to confront the possibility that brutality was never an unavoidable consequence of power, but a failure of it. This thought lingers, heavy and uncomfortable. It challenges the narratives he has relied upon to justify endurance, compromise, and silence. If restraint was possible here, then its absence elsewhere was not inevitable. It was chosen. The weight of that possibility presses against him, threatening to unravel the moral shortcuts he has taken to survive. He feels a subtle shift within himself, a recalibration of fear. It is no longer the fear of being harmed, but the fear of being seen clearly. Courtesy, he realizes, removes the noise that cruelty creates. It strips away distraction, leaving only behavior and intent exposed. In this quiet, there is nowhere to hide behind suffering. The room's discipline demands something from him that pain never did: accountability. Not in a legal sense, but in a human one. He senses that how he carries himself now matters, that his actions will be interpreted without the distortions of rage or contempt. This expectation feels heavier than chains. It implies that he is being treated as someone capable of choice, even in captivity. This realization introduces a profound unease. Victimhood had always offered him a shield. It allowed him to locate blame externally, to survive by framing himself as acted upon rather than acting. Courtesy dismantles that shield. It does not accuse him, but it does not excuse him either. It situates him within a moral landscape where restraint invites reflection rather than resistance. He becomes aware of the quiet confidence that underpins this environment. It is not arrogance, but assurance born of continuity. These men represent institutions that believe themselves stable enough to withstand moments of vulnerability without resorting to excess. Their restraint suggests a long view of authority, one that extends beyond the immediate crisis of war. This long view unsettles him. It implies that power here is not desperate. It does not fear losing control if it loosens its grip momentarily. This stands in stark contrast to the regimes he has known, where cruelty often betrayed insecurity rather than strength. The difference is stark and difficult to ignore. As this understanding deepens, he feels an unexpected sense of diminishment. Not humiliation, but a quiet shrinking born of recognition. He realizes that the power confronting him does not need his fear to exist. His dread, so carefully cultivated over years, is irrelevant here. This realization leaves him feeling strangely empty, as though a familiar weight has been removed without his consent. Yet alongside this emptiness emerges something else, equally unsettling: a grudging clarity. He sees now that authority expressed through restraint can be more absolute than authority expressed through violence. Violence invites resistance, even if only internally. Restraint offers no such release. It demands compliance without spectacle, submission without drama. The moral reversal embedded in this encounter becomes impossible to ignore. He had entered the room prepared to endure cruelty and emerge morally intact through suffering. Instead, he finds himself spared humiliation and left morally exposed. Courtesy has not softened the encounter, it has sharpened it. As the chapter draws toward its close, the room remains unchanged, its atmosphere steady and controlled. But the man within it is altered. His understanding of power has shifted, not toward admiration, but toward a more unsettling recognition of its complexity. He no longer sees restraint as the absence of force, but as a different expression of it. He stands quietly, aware that something fundamental has been reoriented within him. The war, he realizes, is not only fought through violence and resistance, but through the quiet assertion of values under pressure. In this room, courtesy has revealed itself not as kindness, but as confidence, and in doing so, it has undermined the moral certainties he brought with him across the threshold. The encounter no longer feels contained within the walls of the room. Its implications begin to stretch outward, threading themselves into the broader fabric of the war, where countless similar moments unfold unseen and unrecorded. The man senses this widening even as he remains physically still. What he is experiencing is not merely personal, it is emblematic of a larger machinery at work, one that governs how empires sustain themselves under pressure and how they choose to define legitimacy when violence has become commonplace. He begins to understand that this room is not an exception carved out by individual temperament, but a deliberate extension of a system. The restraint shown here reflects a belief that order must be preserved even when everything else is unraveling. It suggests that authority, to endure, must be disciplined not only in how it commands others, but in how it governs itself. This realization reframes the war in his mind, shifting it from a simple clash of force into a collision of institutional philosophies. Beyond these walls, cities burn and borders dissolve. Armies advance and retreat, leaving behind landscapes shaped by urgency and loss. Yet here, within this controlled space, the war appears almost abstracted, filtered through procedure and restraint. This contrast unsettles him. It suggests that while destruction rages elsewhere, there are still places where conduct is regulated by principles that refuse to bend entirely to chaos. He thinks of the regimes he has known, where power was maintained through constant reinforcement of fear. In those systems, cruelty was not merely a byproduct of war, it was a governing principle. Fear ensured compliance, but it also demanded escalation. Each act of brutality required another to maintain its effect. Authority became trapped in a cycle of excess, unable to retreat without appearing weak. The courtesy he encounters now exposes the cost of that approach. This exposure feels almost accusatory, though no accusation is spoken. The restraint in the room operates as an unspoken critique of systems that confuse domination with strength. It demonstrates that authority can persist without constant spectacle, that obedience can be secured through predictability rather than terror. This implication reverberates within him, forcing him to reconsider the inevitability of the suffering he has witnessed and endured. He realizes that this encounter represents a quieter battlefield, one where values are tested not through heroism or sacrifice, but through consistency. The men before him are not engaged in moral grandstanding. They are not attempting to prove righteousness. Their conduct suggests something more unsettling, a belief that their way of exercising power does not require justification. It simply exists, sustained by continuity and expectation. This belief challenges him deeply. Throughout the war, moral clarity often emerged through extremes. Violence created villains and victims, simplifying the narrative even as it destroyed lives. Restraint complicates that clarity. It introduces ambiguity, demanding reflection rather than reaction. In this ambiguity, he finds himself stripped of the emotional armor that suffering once provided. He begins to sense how empires imprint themselves not only through conquest, but through behavior. The courtesy shown here is not an act of kindness toward him personally, it is a performance of identity. It communicates to allies and enemies alike that authority, in this system, is inseparable from self-control. This message is subtle, but its implications are vast. It suggests that power grounded in discipline seeks longevity rather than domination alone. The man feels the weight of this realization press against his own history. He thinks of moments when cruelty was normalized, when excess was celebrated as necessity. He remembers how easily moral boundaries dissolved under the pressure of survival. In contrast, the restraint he witnesses now appears almost defiant in its refusal to surrender entirely to war's logic. This defiance is quiet, but it is no less potent. It does not challenge violence directly, it renders it unnecessary within this context. That distinction unsettles him. It implies that the brutality he associated with power may have been less a requirement than a failure of imagination, a surrender to expedience. As his thoughts widen, he begins to see the war not only as a struggle between nations, but as a contest between methods of control. Some systems seek compliance through fear, accepting moral erosion as collateral damage. Others prioritize stability through procedure, believing that legitimacy is preserved through restraint. Neither approach is without consequence, but the contrast between them is now impossible for him to ignore. He senses that history will judge these differences unevenly. Battles will be remembered, victories and defeats recorded, but the quieter practices of governance will leave subtler traces. They will shape institutions, influence post-war order, and determine how power is remembered. This realization lends the room a strange gravity. What happens here feels like a small but significant thread in a much larger tapestry. The courtesy he encounters now feels less personal and more emblematic. It represents a claim that authority can survive scrutiny, that it does not need to obscure itself behind cruelty. This claim does not absolve the empire it represents, but it complicates the narrative of oppression and resistance that has sustained him. It suggests that power, when confident, can afford restraint, and that restraint itself becomes a signal of dominance. This understanding leaves him conflicted. He does not feel admiration, but neither can he dismiss what he is witnessing as mere performance. The consistency of the conduct, its lack of theatricality, persuades him that this is not an act designed for him alone. It is a habit ingrained deeply enough to persist even when no audience is present. He realizes with a quiet unease that this habit shapes not only how others are treated, but how those within the system understand themselves. Restraint becomes a form of self-definition, a boundary that preserves identity under pressure. In contrast, systems that rely on cruelty risk losing themselves in their own excess. This insight casts his own experiences in a harsher light. He wonders how many acts of brutality he has witnessed that were justified as necessary when in fact they revealed weakness rather than strength. He wonders how many choices were framed as unavoidable when alternatives may have existed but were dismissed as impractical. The room remains unchanged, but the war feels different to him now. It no longer appears solely as a landscape of suffering imposed by circumstance. It appears, at least in part, as a series of decisions made under pressure, choices that reveal underlying values. This perspective is unsettling because it suggests responsibility where he once perceived inevitability. As this chapter draws toward its end, the man feels the weight of history pressing closer. He understands that the encounter he is living through will not end when he leaves the room. Its implications will follow him, reshaping how he interprets authority, obedience, and survival. The courtesy he expected to mask cruelty has instead exposed something deeper and more enduring. In this moment, the war expands beyond guns and uniforms. It becomes a struggle over how power defines itself when tested, over whether restraint can endure without being mistaken for weakness. The man stands quietly, aware that he is witnessing not just an interrogation or an administrative process, but a demonstration of how empires imagine their own permanence. What finally changes is not the room nor the posture of the men within it, but the way the man carries the moment forward inside himself. When the encounter begins to draw toward its end, there is no dramatic release, no clear signal that something decisive has occurred. Instead, there is a gradual loosening of tension, subtle enough that it might be missed by anyone expecting resolution to announce itself loudly. The silence remains, but it no longer feels like an obstacle. It has become a space through which understanding moves quietly. He becomes aware that whatever has taken place here cannot be undone by simply leaving. The absence of cruelty has done something irreversible. It has unsettled the internal architecture that allowed him to survive the war by simplifying it. He had relied on clear moral boundaries, on the belief that suffering conferred meaning and that brutality revealed truth. Now those boundaries feel porous, less reliable than they once were. As he prepares to depart the room, he notices how unchanged it appears. The chairs are still aligned. The air remains cool and orderly. Nothing bears the mark of confrontation. This ordinariness is striking. It suggests that what he experienced was not exceptional, not a moment set aside for him alone, but part of a larger continuity. The system that produced this encounter will continue to operate long after he is gone, indifferent to whether he fully understands it or not. This realization follows him as he steps away from the immediate presence of authority. He feels lighter in one sense, relieved that the humiliation he anticipated never arrived. Yet that relief is incomplete, complicated by a lingering unease. He has not been broken, but neither has he been affirmed. The encounter has denied him both suffering and absolution. It leaves him carrying questions rather than wounds. In the quiet that follows, he reflects on how deeply the war has shaped his expectations. He recognizes now that fear taught him not only how to survive, but how to misinterpret power. It trained him to believe that cruelty was the most honest expression of authority, that restraint was either deception or weakness. This belief allowed him to navigate a world where brutality was normalized. But here, that belief has been challenged without argument or force. The challenge lingers precisely because it was understated. There was no attempt to persuade him, no moral lesson delivered explicitly. The courtesy he encountered made no claim to righteousness. It simply existed, consistent and unyielding. This consistency proves more unsettling than condemnation would have been. It denies him the comfort of dismissal. As he moves further away from the moment, he realizes that the silence he experienced was not empty, but instructive. It taught him that power does not always reveal itself through violence, and that restraint can be a form of dominance that leaves fewer marks but deeper impressions. This understanding does not make him feel safer. It makes the world feel more complex, less predictable. He begins to sense how this complexity will shadow him beyond the war. Long after battles are concluded and borders redrawn, the memory of this encounter will persist as a quiet reference point. It will complicate simple narratives of good and evil, forcing him to acknowledge that moral clarity is not always aligned with suffering or force. This realization feels heavy, almost burdensome, because it demands reflection rather than reaction. The war, he now understands, is not only a sequence of violent events but a series of moral exposures. In moments like this, individuals are confronted not with what they endure, but with what they assume.